My husband called me basic in front of all our friends, then laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. I smiled, holding my wine glass with steady hands, but inside something cracked. That one word, basic, wasn't just a joke. It was a mirror, revealing how little he saw me, how far he had drifted from the man I married. And if he thought I was basic, he had no idea what was coming next. Because in less than a month, I would uncover his $3 million secret, and by the time I was done, the smug smile he wore that night would be wiped clean off his face. It started the night of our anniversary dinner. Oddly enough, he'd planned nothing. No flowers, no dinner reservation, not even a card. I spent the evening in a dress he used to love, eating leftovers while he scrolled through his phone. I asked gently if he'd forgotten. He chuckled and muttered something about anniversaries being overrated marketing schemes, and told me to chill, basic girl. That word again. He tossed it out like confetti, not realizing it was cutting deeper every time. But this story isn't about the hurt. It's about what came after. I'm Rachel, 34, marketing consultant, and until recently, I thought I had a pretty good life. My husband, Derek, was charming, successful, and wildly respected in our social circles. He owned a financial consultancy firm that had skyrocketed in value during the past 5 years. People used to joke that he had the Midas touch. Everything he touched turned to gold. And for a while, I believed that too. We had the house, the car, the vacations. He had the suits and the swagger. And I had the kind of quiet devotion people don't notice until it's gone. The unraveling began with a stupid printer jam. I was working from home one afternoon when I needed to print a contract. Derek's home office was off limits, but he wasn't home and I figured one quick print wouldn't hurt. That's when I saw it. An envelope, thick and slightly torn at the edge, wedged under a stack of reports. It wasn't labeled. Curious, I pulled it free and found inside several pages of bank records. Offshore accounts under a name I didn't recognize but with his signature clear as day. I wasn't looking for dirt. I never even doubted him before. But something about those documents, the dates, the amounts, wire transfers in the hundreds of thousands, started a spark in my gut that wouldn't go out. I knew I couldn't confront him without knowing more. If I was wrong, I'd destroy everything for nothing. But if I was right, for the next few weeks, I played the part. Smiled at dinner. Laughed at his colleagues' jokes during our wine nights. Wore the heels he liked and bit my tongue every time he made those casual little digs. But when he kissed me goodnight, I was logging into cloud backups, tracing emails, digging through digital shadows he thought were long buried. And that's when the full picture came together. Derek was siphoning money from his own clients. People who trusted him with their life savings. Some were elderly. Some were single moms investing everything into a hopeful future. He wasn't just hiding money, he was stealing it. Moving it through shell companies, spreading it across accounts in Dubai, Singapore, Panama. $3 million over 3 years. Clean on the surface, rotten underneath. The worst part? He wasn't even careful. He thought he was too clever, too charming to be caught. And maybe by the law he was. But I had something else, motive, opportunity, and access. The moment of truth came 3 days after I met with a lawyer friend of mine in secret. I invited all our close friends over for Derek's birthday party. He loved grand gestures, so I made it big, decorated the entire house, hired a private chef, the works. He soaked it in, kissed me in front of everyone, made another comment about how I always did the basic Pinterest stuff. Then I plugged in the projector. I made a little birthday video, I said, smiling sweetly. A surprise. The first minute was harmless. Clips from past birthdays, vacations, inside jokes. Then came the screenshots. Emails. Voice notes. A time-stamped breakdown of his transactions. The room froze. You could hear forks clink against porcelain. And Derek's face drained of every drop of color. Happy birthday, sweetheart, I said softly. I thought your friends should know what the real Midas touch looks like. He tried to laugh it off, muttering that it was a prank. But no one laughed. His best friend stood up, eyes wide. 2 others checked their phones. Someone muttered, "Is this real?" And I just nodded. I wish I could say he was arrested right there, but it doesn't work like that. What happened instead was slower. That night, 3 clients pulled out immediately. The next morning, his firm was hit with an audit request. The day after, the media caught wind of the leak. I never said a word publicly. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. And me? I filed for divorce the same week, presented my lawyer with every file I'd backed up. It turns out, when you help bring down a fraud of this scale, the court tends to side with you. I walked away with the house, a full settlement, and the peace of knowing I didn't just survive, I exposed a monster. So when people ask me if I regret it, I tell them this. Never underestimate a woman you think is basic. Because sometimes, she's the only one willing to bring the whole empire down. Rachel was the kind of woman people overlooked in a crowd, not because she wasn't beautiful, but because she didn't demand to be seen. She was all the quiet things, thoughtful, reliable, calm. She didn't dress to turn heads, didn't speak over others, and she certainly didn't play games. At 34, she had built a life on quiet strength, on being the dependable one. The one who remembered birthdays, who texted to ask if someone got home safe, who made lists and followed through. She wasn't flashy. She was consistent. And she had always thought that consistency was a kind of love. Derek, on the other hand, was a man born with a spotlight stitched into his skin. Everything about him radiated ease, his laugh, the way he walked into a room like it was built for him. When they first met, it was that confidence that drew her in. He had a way of making people feel like they were the only ones in the room. And for a while, she was the only one. They met in their late 20s at a networking event she almost skipped. He was magnetic, standing near the bar with a loosened tie and a story on his lips that had half the room listening. She had arrived with a notepad and a resume tucked in her handbag, wearing a navy blouse she bought on sale the night before. When Derek noticed her, it felt like the world shifted slightly in her favor. He asked her what she did, and when she told him she worked in branding for a small firm, he didn't ask for more. He looked her right in the eyes and said, "You seem like someone who listens more than she talks. That's rare. People talk too much." It wasn't exactly romantic, but it made her feel seen. And God, that meant everything to her back then. Their early relationship was filled with late-night drives and deep talks. He said he wanted someone real, someone grounded, and she wanted someone who could carry her into rooms she never thought she belonged in. For a while they were the perfect contrast, him with his risk-taking, her with her plans. He made her feel brave. She made him feel stable. But love can rot quietly. And slowly, Rachel started noticing things that didn't feel quite right, like the way Derek spoke over her in conversations. The way he called her cute when she tried to share something serious. The way he complimented other women in front of her. Not cruelly, but pointedly. "Look at her," he'd say. "That's what confidence looks like. Not afraid to wear what she wants." It was always cloaked in praise, but it chipped away at Rachel's self-worth bit by bit, until she started second-guessing everything she wore, everything she said. Still she stayed. Because sometimes the fear of starting over feels heavier than the weight of being unseen. By year 3 of their marriage, Derek's company had exploded in growth. He brought in new investors, opened a second office in Miami, and started traveling more. He bought himself a Tesla, then a Rolex. He upgraded their kitchen, hired a part-time housekeeper, and joked that Rachel didn't have to work anymore if she didn't want to. But she wanted to. She needed to. Work had always been Rachel's anchor. It wasn't just about money. It was about her identity, about having something that was hers. But Derek, in his ever-smooth way, made her feel silly for needing that. "You already won," he'd say. "You've got me. You've got the lifestyle. Relax." But she wasn't relaxed. She was uneasy. And she couldn't put her finger on why. Not yet. It didn't help that their social circle began to shift. Suddenly, Rachel found herself surrounded by high-powered wives with glossy nails and designer bags. Women who talked about boarding schools and Botox over brunch. They smiled politely when she mentioned work, but rarely asked questions. At parties, Derek would tell exaggerated stories about how he rescued Rachel from a boring desk job. She was working for peanuts, he'd laugh. Total waste of her talent. Now she just handles the guest lists. Rachel learned to laugh too. Not because it was funny, but because that's what you do when your husband builds a world where your voice doesn't echo back. Still, not everything was bad. There were good days. He brought her flowers sometimes. He told her she was beautiful, kissed her on the forehead. On rare nights, they'd curl up on the couch with takeout and old movies, and he'd rest his head on her lap like nothing had changed. And in those moments, she would let herself believe it could still work. But deep inside, Rachel knew something was wrong. Not just in their relationship, but with Derek. There were subtle red flags. Receipts from restaurants she'd never been to. Sudden phone calls that made him step out of the room. A new bank account she discovered while filing taxes. He had excuses for everything, and they were always delivered with such calm authority that she almost believed them. Almost. Then came the night of the charity gala. It was a black tie affair for one of Derek's client organizations, a sleek, upscale event with velvet ropes and champagne fountains. Rachel wore a burgundy gown she'd rented last minute, and Derek arrived late, sweaty, smiling but oddly breathless. During dinner, he leaned over and whispered, "Don't talk too much tonight. You have this habit of over-explaining." She blinked at him, stunned. "What does that mean?" "Nothing bad," he said with a shrug. "Just don't make it weird, okay?" And with that, he turned to his table mates and started discussing a cryptocurrency investment like she wasn't even there. That night, as they drove home in silence, Rachel stared out the window and thought, "I'm married to a stranger who thinks I'm an accessory." It hit her then, harder than ever before. Whatever this marriage was, it wasn't love anymore. It was optics. A performance. And she was done playing a role. But here's where it gets complicated. Derek wasn't evil. Not in the storybook sense. He didn't hit her. He didn't cheat, at least not that she could prove yet. He was just hollow. Image-driven. Obsessed with legacy and control. He had grown up poor, one of 4 siblings, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs. Rachel had met her once, sweet, tired, wary. Derek rarely spoke of her. His father left when he was 10, and every success Derek chased seemed to scream, "See me. I matter." Rachel understood the hole he was trying to fill. But understanding someone doesn't mean you excuse them. And then, of course, there were the accounts. Rachel's discovery of the offshore documents wasn't accidental. Not entirely. She'd been suspicious for months but hadn't dared dig too deep. But the moment she saw his signature on a foreign wire transfer, $325,000 routed through a shell company, everything clicked. Derek wasn't just neglecting her. He was hiding something massive. And dangerous. She didn't confront him. Not immediately. She wanted proof. And the more she found, the sicker she felt. Over the course of 2 weeks, she uncovered patterns, deliberate patterns, fake invoices, misleading reports, false expense entries. Derek had been running a side operation, cleverly disguised within his consultancy firm. It looked legitimate on the surface, but it wasn't. He had been slowly draining money from client portfolios, investing it under pseudonyms, and laundering it through foreign entities. It was genius. It was evil. And it was all traceable. Rachel kept records. Screenshots. Backups. Voice memos where she dictated what she found, in case anything ever happened to her. Because Derek might not have hit her, but when you uncover a multi-million-dollar fraud, caution becomes your best friend. And yet, part of her still hoped she was wrong. That it was some elaborate tax loophole. That he'd explain it all and they could fix it. But that hope died the night she heard him on the phone. He didn't know she was awake. It was past midnight. Rachel had stepped into the hallway for water and paused by his office door. It was cracked open just enough. And Derek was whispering, "It's handled. No, she doesn't know anything. She's too busy with her candles and Pinterest boards. She still thinks I'm the good guy. Relax." Rachel didn't breathe. Didn't move. Just listened. That was the moment something inside her snapped clean in two. He didn't just dismiss her. He underestimated her. Mocked her. And he was wrong. Because she knew more than he thought. And she wasn't going to stay quiet. The morning after Derek's birthday party was eerily quiet. Rachel sat at the kitchen island with a mug of untouched coffee, staring at the marble countertop, waiting. Waiting for the inevitable storm. Upstairs, she could hear Derek pacing. The footsteps were fast, uneven. Nothing like his usual cool, calculated rhythm. She didn't go up. She didn't need to. Last night had already changed everything. By 9 a.m., the first call came in. Derek's business partner, Jake, wanted to know if the video was real. If the documents shown names, account numbers, transaction logs, had actually come from their firm's files. Derek brushed it off, said it was a malicious prank, some kind of hacked manipulation. But by noon, 2 clients had pulled out. By 3 p.m., a financial blog had picked up the leaked footage, uploaded by someone at the party who had quietly filmed it all with their phone. By the end of the day, Derek's name was trending on Twitter. Financial genius or fraud? Whistleblower wife exposes millionaire husband at his own birthday bash. The collapse of a Wall Street star. What we know about Derek Lang's alleged scam. Rachel hadn't spoken to the press. She hadn't said a word, in fact. But the internet didn't wait for facts. Clips of the party were everywhere. Her soft voice introducing the birthday surprise. Derek's blank face as the truth unfolded. The stunned silence of the room as the last slide showed $3 million in red. Some people praised her, called her brave. Others doubted her, said it looked staged. That maybe she was just a bitter ex trying to destroy a good man. That maybe she was involved. Rachel watched it all with quiet detachment. She didn't answer texts. She didn't check emails. She watered her plants and opened the windows and let the wind move through the house like it was trying to cleanse it. She felt hollow and strangely calm. Derek, on the other hand, was unraveling. The man who once wore pressure like cologne now snapped at every sound, cursed under his breath, deleted files from his laptop like a panicked teenager hiding secrets. At one point, he turned to her in the hallway and said, "You don't understand what you've done." Rachel didn't flinch. "No," she said. You don't. He stared at her for a long time, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not rage, but fear. For the first time in years, Derek looked scared of her. Over the next week, the fallout spread like wildfire. Auditors showed up at his firm. Clients froze accounts. Legal teams sent emails. Every financial move he had made over the past 5 years was now under review. Rachel had handed over everything, carefully legally. She wasn't after revenge. She was after justice. And she was methodical about it. But that didn't mean she didn't suffer. Friends distanced themselves. Some out of discomfort. Some out of disbelief. Her own mother called and asked, "Are you sure it had to be public like that? Couldn't you have handled it privately?" Rachel couldn't explain that it had to be public. That Derek wouldn't have stopped if she'd just confronted him alone. That the only way to truly expose a man like that was to burn the mask in front of an audience. But the loneliness crept in, quiet and cold. Late at night, she'd lie in bed and feel the weight of the past decade pressing on her chest. The birthdays, the little traditions, the soft moments. Were they all a lie? Or had Derek changed slowly, like a tide retreating inch by inch until she was stranded on dry sand without realizing it? Sometimes she hated him. Sometimes she missed him. But what hurt more was missing herself. The version of Rachel that laughed without caution. That danced barefoot in the living room. That believed love was enough to fix anything. Still, there were glimmers of something new. Her inbox began to fill. Not with reporters but with strangers. Women mostly. One wrote, "Your story made me realize I've been living in silence. Thank you for speaking out." Another said, "You reminded me that being quiet doesn't mean being weak." Someone else simply wrote, "I saw you. I believed you." Rachel cried when she read that last one. Because for so long, she hadn't been believed. She'd been dismissed, downplayed, folded neatly into someone else's narrative. But now her truth had weight. It rippled. Derek, meanwhile, tried to control the damage. He went on a podcast and said it was all a misunderstanding. Blamed a vindictive spouse with a vendetta. But it didn't land. The calm, charismatic image no longer held. He looked tired. Defensive. Like a man who knew the walls were closing in. The SEC got involved 2 weeks later. That night, Rachel stood in her backyard under the fading orange sky, and finally felt air move through her lungs again. Not because it was over, it wasn't. But because she had made it through the worst part. She had spoken. She had acted. And something strange began to return to her. Not happiness exactly, but clarity, strength. She started going for morning walks. She joined a local writing group. She reconnected with a friend she hadn't seen in 3 years. The kind of friend who asked real questions. The kind who listened when Rachel spoke about grief and guilt and survival. Once, while they sat at a coffee shop, that friend looked at her and said, "You don't seem basic to me. You seem brave." Rachel smiled. Not because she needed the validation, but because part of her finally believed it. Derek's world had collapsed. But Rachel's? Hers was just beginning. Rachel had always believed change happened slowly, like the tide shifting, the way hair grays or hands wrinkle. But some changes come in one breath. One choice. One moment where you stop waiting for the storm to pass and realize you are the storm. That moment came for Rachel on a Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting on a park bench near a small lake, one she'd walked past for years but never really noticed. Ducks bobbed quietly across the surface, and in the distance, kids laughed from a nearby playground. She clutched a folder in her lap, thin, clean but heavy with weight. Inside were copies of every file she had collected on Derek. She wasn't carrying it for legal strategy. That had already been handled. She was carrying it to remember who she had become. Because this wasn't just about exposing a fraud anymore. This was about reclaiming herself. It had been 3 weeks since the party, and Derek's firm was in a tailspin. Regulatory bodies had launched investigations. His clients had nearly all vanished. And he was hemorrhaging money fighting to hold on to his crumbling reputation. He wasn't the man on magazine covers anymore. He was the cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. But Rachel knew how these stories could shift. Men like Derek always had a card up their sleeve, rebranding, blaming, rewriting. She couldn't let that happen. Not this time. That night, she sat down at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen. Not a laptop. Not a phone. Just paper and her thoughts. She wrote a list. Not of things to do, but of truths. Hard truths. Ones she had never spoken aloud, even to herself. 1. I allowed myself to shrink for someone who never saw my full size. 2. I stayed quiet out of fear, not loyalty. 3. I was never too basic. I was just too real for a man addicted to masks. 4. I deserved to be seen. Not as decoration, not as support, but as whole. The act of writing it down felt like shedding skin. And from that moment, Rachel stopped waiting for closure. She started building her future. The first step was legal. Her lawyer had been helpful, but now she needed more than legal action. She needed protection. She filed for a financial restraining order to freeze any remaining joint assets. She contacted the whistleblower office at the SEC and formally submitted her evidence with a detailed timeline. She knew that under federal law, whistleblowers could receive a percentage of recovered funds. Not that she did it for money, but she wasn't about to walk away empty-handed again. The second step was emotional. She began therapy. It was awkward at first. Sitting in a softly lit room, being asked questions like, "How do you define safety?" And "When did you stop feeling like yourself?" But it helped. Slowly, she learned that manipulation isn't always loud. It can be quiet, smiling, disguised as jokes and passive insults. She learned that boundaries weren't walls but doors you chose when to open. And most of all, she learned that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant forgiving yourself for staying too long. Meanwhile, Derek was coming undone. At first he tried denial. Publicly dismissed the accusations. Claimed Rachel was emotionally unstable. But that narrative didn't land. Not when the documents were so damning. Not when his own colleagues began turning on him. Then came his panic phase. Late-night calls to lawyers, failed attempts to relocate money, whispered arguments with his now former business partner. But it was the regret that came next. And that, oddly, was the hardest to watch. He called Rachel one night. She didn't answer at first. Just stared at the screen flashing his name, her heart suddenly louder than her thoughts. But something in her said, "Pick up. You're not afraid anymore. Asterisk. Rachel." His voice cracked on the other end. "I messed up." Silence. "I don't know how it got this far," he continued. "I thought I could manage it, Clean it up before it got messy. But you, he paused almost in awe. You blindsided me. At my own party. Rachel waited a beat, then said calmly, you didn't see me coming because you never bothered to look. He exhaled. Do you hate me? She didn't answer right away. I hate what you became. And I hate what I let you turn me into. There was silence again. He asked if they could meet. Said he wanted to explain. She agreed, but only under one condition. The meeting would be recorded and take place in a neutral, monitored space. She wasn't playing games anymore. They met at a mediation office. Sterile walls, security at the front desk, everything neutral. Derek looked smaller. Not physically, but spiritually. Like someone who had worn too many masks for too long and now didn't know what his own face looked like. I built everything for us, he said bitterly, staring at the glass of water in front of him. And you destroyed it in 10 minutes. Rachel smiled faintly. You didn't build it for us. You built it for your ego. You used me as your set piece. He leaned forward. You're angry. I get it. But can't we salvage something? Salvage what? She asked, her voice steady. There's no us left. You made sure of that the moment you started lying. He swallowed hard, but didn't argue. That silence was his confession. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were signed divorce papers, asset division requests, and a personal statement that she intended to submit to federal investigators. One that included his willingness to cooperate, if he chose to. She was giving him a chance. Not out of pity, but because it made her stronger to end this with dignity. Sign them, she said. And maybe, just maybe, you can stop this from getting worse. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. The next morning, the papers were filed. Rachel didn't feel victorious. Not exactly. What she felt was cleaner, lighter, like stepping out of a burning building and finally smelling fresh air. And the world noticed. News coverage shifted. She was no longer the angry wife or the vindictive whistleblower. She became the woman who stood up. The woman who exposed a millionaire and walked away without fear. She was invited onto a podcast about female resilience, then a local news segment. She didn't share everything. Just enough. Enough to remind people that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet and deliberate and patient. And it changes everything. Rachel stood in her own home now, not hers, and redecorated slowly. She chose warm colors, soft lights, and bookshelves filled with stories of women who dared to speak. She adopted a rescue dog named Leo. She began journaling again. Cooking for pleasure. Wearing red lipstick just because it made her feel good, not because it pleased anyone else. She had lost a lot. Time. Trust. Pieces of herself. But she gained something much more powerful. Her voice. Her truth. And the unshakable knowledge that when the world calls you basic, you don't have to shout to prove them wrong. You just show them what happens when a woman stops waiting for permission. The courtroom was colder than Rachel expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Everything was gray, floors, suits, expressions. The kind of place where emotion felt like weakness and facts were king. And yet, it was here, in this sterile room with its ticking clock and heavy silence, that the final threads of her story would be pulled tight. Derek sat 3 chairs to her left, flanked by 2 attorneys. He looked thinner than the last time she saw him, a man drained by stress and shame. His once perfect posture now sagged with exhaustion. His designer suit slightly rumpled, as if he no longer had the strength to care. Gone was the smirk, the air of superiority. What remained was a shell. A man who had played too many games with other people's futures and finally lost. Rachel, on the other hand, wore navy. Not flashy, not dramatic. Just strong. Clean. Intentional. Her hair was pulled back, her face calm. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already lived through the worst of it. Today was not the battle. Today was the end of the war. The hearing had been scheduled as a final review of Derek's plea agreement. After months of investigation, the evidence Rachel had provided, along with corroborating testimony from his former partner, had left Derek with few options. He could fight and face trial, or take a deal that required him to admit guilt, surrender most of his assets, and agree to a financial ban from the industry for life. He'd chosen the deal. Not because he wanted to, but because Rachel had left him no escape route. The judge read through the terms slowly. Each clause felt like a line of closure being etched into stone. Derek would forfeit his company, liquidate offshore accounts, and pay restitution to his victims through a government-supervised fund. His name would never again appear on a boardroom plaque. His career was over. Not just paused, over. Rachel didn't smile. She didn't need to. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes, it looks like a man being forced to watch his empire fall brick by stolen brick. As the judge asked if the defendant had any final remarks, Derek stood. For a moment, Rachel braced herself, expecting some last attempt to spin the story, to throw her under the bus. But instead, he looked at the judge, then directly at her. "I lied," he said quietly. "To my clients. My partners. My wife." He swallowed hard. "Especially her." Rachel didn't move. She held his gaze like stone. "I built something powerful," he continued. "But I built it on shortcuts. On greed. I thought if I kept growing, if the numbers kept climbing, it would all even out. That no one would get hurt." He paused, his voice cracking. "But people did. And I lost the one person who believed in me before any of this started." Silence followed. A heavy silence. Rachel didn't cry. There was no satisfaction in his confession, no joy in his unraveling. Just truth. And finally, after so many lies, that was enough. When the judge gavelled the decision, it was over. Just like that. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright. Reporters stood behind barricades, cameras ready. Rachel had no interest in interviews. Her lawyer fielded questions while she walked quietly down the courthouse steps, the folder of closing documents tucked neatly under her arm. She took a deep breath. For the first time in years, there was no script. No role to play. No performance to maintain. Just the simple reality of freedom. But it wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something entirely new. 2 months later, Rachel launched a nonprofit. It was called the Second Voice Project, a support network for women in high-control relationships, especially those silenced by emotional manipulation, financial dependency, or reputational threats. The mission was simple: help women find their voice before they lose themselves. The idea was born from her own journal. Page after page of self-doubt, half-formed fears, and internal battles she had once been too ashamed to name. Now she turned those pages into programming, online workshops, legal resources, empowerment retreats, real tools for women who felt invisible. And people responded. Emails poured in from all over the country. Survivors, advocates, even former clients of Derek's who had been too afraid to speak before. She wasn't just Rachel Lang, the ex-wife of a disgraced financier. She was something else now, something more. She became the woman other women pointed to and said, "She got out. She stood up. Maybe I can too." But her healing wasn't just public. It was deeply personal. In her quiet moments, early mornings before coffee, late nights under a blanket on the couch, she allowed herself to grieve, to mourn the years she had given, the girl she used to be, the love that had never been real enough to last. And in that space of mourning, something beautiful bloomed. Forgiveness. Not for Derek. Not entirely. But for herself. For staying. For shrinking. For once believing that being loved meant being less. She even wrote him a letter. Not to send, but to release. It read, "You saw me as an accessory. A background. But I was always the main character. You just couldn't see it through your own reflection. I hope you find whatever part of yourself you lost so long ago. But I won't wait for you to do it. I'm already free. And she was. One spring morning, Rachel stood in front of a group of women at her first live seminar. Some were shaking. Some were weeping. All were listening. She told her story, not with bitterness but with clarity. "People called me basic," she said with a smile, "because I liked simple joys. Candles, quiet mornings, handwritten notes. But basic doesn't mean boring. And it doesn't mean weak. It means real. Uncomplicated. Honest." The room was silent, waiting. "And it turns out," she continued, "when you strip away all the lies, That's what power really looks like, being real, being whole, being yourself, even when the world tells you to be smaller. A woman in the front row clapped. Then another. And then the whole room. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't need to. She stood in the sound of their applause like it was sunlight. Because this was her story now. Not Derek's. Not anyone else's. It ended not in destruction, but in rebirth. And if you ask her what she would say to the woman she used to be, the one who smiled through insults, who folded herself smaller to fit inside someone else's shadow, she'd say this. He called you basic. You showed him brilliance.